France 24 debate. We're looking at the stalemate in Ukraine, the back and forth that we saw of riot police overnight, first deploying and then easing up. With us to talk about it from Kiev, our correspondent Gulliver Cragg. Also with us in Kiev is Rostislav Pavlenko, member of Parliament for the opposition, member of the opposition for Vitaly Klitschko's Udar party, and joining us here in the studio, Ina Shevchenko, activist with the Femen movement, and Celestine Bolin, whose column this week or next week?
Next week.
Next week will be seen in the International New York Times. What's the topic?
Well, actually, it is going to be about this issue of Ukraine and actually Moldova, which is the small...
Moldova, which signed on to that EU partnership.
Which signed on, Europe's smallest, I mean, not smallest, but poorest country, which weathered the storm and actually kind of went ahead despite Russian pressure and signed it. Obviously, it's not as important as Ukraine, but it's sort of taken a kind of a
We'll talk about that, about how this is playing out throughout the whole region. In fact, a man will help us with that when we broach that part of the conversation. Joining us now from Moscow, Viktor Nadayin-Rayevsky of the Institute of World Economy and International Relations. Thank you for being with us from the Russian capital. Now, just to remind people, after he backed out of that EU deal last month, Ukraine's president said just how underwhelmed he was with its terms.
610 million euros is just technical help for Ukraine. Starting in 2010, for 3 years in a row, they were showing us this candy in a nice wrapper, and they were saying, you will get this when you sign an agreement with the IMF. I don't want to be rude, but you don't have to humiliate us like this. You know, we are not little children. You cannot buy us with sweets.
Of course, Viktor Yanukovych would then go on to Vilnius, where that EU summit was taking place, nonetheless meet with its leaders and trying to keep the door open. Trying to keep the door open, in fact, to the point where this Wednesday, Ukraine's Prime Minister, Mykola Azarov, put in a request to Brussels for 20 billion euros in aid to eventually revive that EU partnership deal.
We're not talking about the European Union giving us the necessary technical support to bring our industry in line with European standards. We are talking about both of us getting involved in big, mutually profitable projects, which have created new jobs in our enterprises over recent years.
Gulliver Cragg, am I to understand that Kiev is still bargaining after the bargain's been cut?
It sounds that way. It doesn't sound like it's exactly the most appropriate time to be asking for 20 billion euros when you've just delivered the kind of slap in the face to the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Catherine Ashton, as there was with last night's police action. It's very hard to see how she could have been happy with the decision to pursue that police intervention last night, right when she was in town to try and broker a compromise and start talks between the government and the opposition. I'd like to ask Rostislav, the MP from UDA, Rostislav Pavlenko, whether or not he confirms that Vitaly Klitschko, the leader of that party, said that after that police intervention, the time for compromise was gone. Because if that's the kind of reaction that they're getting from the opposition, then it's very hard to understand how the Ukrainian government can be, on the one hand, pursuing actions that are likely to alienate EU diplomats and make them feel extremely ill-disposed towards the Ukrainian leadership, and the same with the opposition, at the same time as saying that they want to carry on negotiating for this association agreement and trying to ask for better terms in it.
Rostislav?
Well, for us, it's less of this contradiction that you mentioned. It is more clear that we want early election of president and also parliament. Excuse me. And after that, the new leadership of the country will sign the association agreement, and what is even more important, will fulfill it. Because we see quite an irresponsible President Yanukovych and his government in the approach of the European integration. And this irresponsibility needs to be properly dealt. And this way of proper dealing is actually put into question of Ukrainian people, whether they support this step or not. And actually, what was probably done, as you very rightfully expressed, a slap in the face, we would expect that he would feel the consequence. Because it is quite clear that the president and his entourage and main businessmen or oligarchs who support this change, of course, they have quite vested interests in the Western countries, in the EU, and if not even to mention the word sanctions, but there is fight with corruption, money laundering, or any such things that would send a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated.
Rostislav Pavlenko, I want to thank you. Apologies again for the technical issues we had with the line. Thank you for joining us from Kiev for this part of the discussion. The answer there given by the MP about how there are all these demands before it can all come to a head. Again, Ina Shevchenko, your thoughts on that? How are we going to move the process forward in the short term?
Well, I feel a little bit hurted when you say we cannot recognize it as a revolution, because this is a revolution, and this is, let's say, we can talk even by words of your correspondent that it's 60% of people who are supporting there. And this demonstration is not for personalities. They are not there supporting one or another personality. They are not fighting for having more bread or more food. They are fighting for human rights, for big changes that they believe can finally come to their country. They are fighting for this to be finally not enslaved by one of the empires that during all the history of Ukraine we were enslaved. We were always cut it in the small pieces, and all the empires they were fighting between themselves, and we were just in the shadow. So right now, I believe this is the time when people are coming out with this idea, and how to move the thing. Well, I'm an activist, and I will give you only one answer. What I believe that what right now has to be done, president and government, they're acting, and we don't have to think how do they have to act. We have to think how people have to act and how opposition have to act. What right now has this Maidan has to be transformed. It has to be transformed in a very huge, deep national boycott. They have to stop to work on this government and on this president. They have to stop work of all state institutions and to continue to move what they started, but not to quit, not to leave, and not to hide their flags.
Okay, so you're saying that the next step is perhaps a general strike for you. That's your thought. Celestine Bon, do you feel, how do I put this, tinge of empathy with Ukraine's president? Because on the one hand, he's got the resolve of the opposition. On the other hand, basically, if he did sign on the dotted line with the EU, he knows that Gazprom, the Russians, would turn off the tap. Russia, which already charges, Gazprom charges 3 times more to Ukraine than it does to neighboring Belarus for its natural gas.
Yeah, sympathy is probably not the right word. Pity, perhaps. I mean, in the sense that I think he made various choices along the way. They go before November 21. And I think he's mishandled it. And I think that, at the end of the day, the problem is that it is a divided country. I mean, and that's why I say, sort of revolutions that don't take into account minorities and majorities are tricky business, particularly in a country that's so divided. And that is his problem. I mean, there is one half of the country, and it's not just geographical, it's age, it's Soviet mentality, not mentality. I think if he had slammed the door to Russia, he would have a lot of unhappy people. There wouldn't be this many, and they wouldn't be in the streets, but, they could make life very difficult. He's the president, and he has to handle the two sides of the country. As I say, I don't say sympathy. I think that, he may have to look at the end of his term, sooner rather than later.
Sooner rather than later to bring this to
But he
a
has
head.
to kind of, help come up with a strategy to get out of this.
Victor Nadyin-Rayevsky, let me ask you. Some people have been saying since this began, we're in the third week, that we should stop trying to see it as East versus West, that perhaps there's a way where Ukraine can be friends with everybody. Can Ukraine be friends with both Moscow and Brussels?
Well, it's not a problem for Russians. We just were Ukrainians themselves were speaking about the problem to discuss it totally just together with the European Union, with the participation of Russia. But from Brussels, we heard that it's impossible. That is the problem. For Russia, of course, the problem of their selection, where they're going, whom they're going to join, European Union, either Russia. Of course, it's not an easy problem for us as well, because our industries are quite combined. It of course does not have anything to do with, for example, agriculture. But as for agriculture, I'm afraid that for Ukrainians, there will be rather heavy years when they join any kind of union with the European Union, because you see, European Union supports its agriculture, and it will not give Ukrainians opportunity to sell their goods there in Europe. That will be a problem for Ukraine. But at the same time, Russia will have also a very difficult position for itself, because according to all the regulations, we will have to close our borders for Ukrainian goods, because it is not compatible. The European Union, really, their regulations are not compatible with the ones that they'll have joining this plan.
So let me get Celestine Boland. Let me get Celestine Boland. Let me get Celestine Boland to react to that, to what you just said, because so in other words,
and the whole of the plan is just to ruin not simply the Ukrainian economy. Everything with this economy is understandable. It will be ruined by the European Union. That's not a problem. They'll do it, and rather quickly. But as for Russian economy, that will be a very strong blow, and especially for the industries that are dealing with space, for example, because together with the Ukrainians, we work over the same technology and work just all together.
All right, let me get Victor. Let me just get the reaction of some of the other panelists on this. Celestine Boland, it's a question of either or, and you have to tear up all the.
I don't think so, and I think that there are people on both sides of this debate that are heavily invested in seeing it that way. And I think that the fact is, for instance, I see no reason why Russia has to close its borders to Ukrainian goods just because the Ukrainians sign a treaty that's not even, they're not even members of the European Union. It is, that's, and then for the same speaker to say that it's the Europeans who are making this either or thing. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I think both sides are guilty of this to some extent, and they're ignoring the reality, which is that you can, first of all, Ukraine is not in the European Union, and it's a mess. I mean, if Russia's been its partner for the last 5 years, then maybe we should take stock and look at the situation that it's in. It's not terribly healthy. That they're asking for money again is a kind of a sign of a desperate situation. Anyway, I mean, I think that it would be useful to take it away from this either or, which I think it is ideologically, but not necessarily economically.
You talk about the idea of it's a mess, and we know that Gulliver Crags, there have been since those protests began, several Ukrainian conglomerates that have been put on credit watch. There was a wire agency report this Wednesday that there might even be some wavering from one of the main backers of Ukraine's president, Rinat Akhmetov, one of the country's richest men, who's also the owner of the Shakhtar Donetsk football club. Do you see signs of that the oligarchs, the Ukrainian oligarchs, may be jumping ship?
Absolutely. The strongest sign of that is that all the Ukrainian television channels are presenting more or less either objective or pro-opposition reporting on these protests, with the exception perhaps of the national channel. And these television channels are controlled by the oligarchs. I think a lot of the oligarchs are worried about the possibility of targeted sanctions, the credit rating that you mentioned. I think that they have a lot of interest in Ukraine's business climate cleaning up its act and in dealing more with Europe. But that doesn't mean that they're going to abandon Viktor Yanukovych and withdraw their support for him. The risk in doing that for them is huge. If it doesn't work and he stays in power, they're finished. They're goners. Also, Rinat Akhmetov is still very close to Viktor Yanukovych, and he may disagree with him, and he may be unhappy about the situation that there is now. Experts I've spoken to have said, though, that he, along with a lot of other oligarchs, are still waiting to see what happens and are not taking their decision yet. And Volodymyr Fesenko, a very respected expert political scientist from the Penta Center, said that it's possible that Rinat Akhmetov will exert some kind of pressure on Viktor Yanukovych in order to push him towards a compromise solution. But the idea that Akhmetov would actually abandon Yanukovych completely and start supporting the opposition, that's just not realistic. That was his analysis just before we went on for this show.
All right, Gulliver Cragg, many thanks. Apologies for the connection there, which seems to be losing in quality.
East-west
Ina Shevchenko, it is a big problem. Ukraine is fast running out of money. And
sure, but the question that you just asked your correspondent, if oligarchs are joining the ship, but the thing is that they are there since the beginning. And
some of them are.
Certainly in the case of Chocolate King,
for example,
Petro
Akhmetov,
Poroshenko.
for sure. Because, let's remember the presidential election, and Yanukovych, he was a candidate who was kind of promoted, and he was even lobbied by Akhmetov, this oligarch, the richest person, who is controlling a lot. And let's say his opinion is worth a lot in Ukrainian political situations.
And to Gulliver's point, that the TV stations owned by some of these oligarchs are actually reporting the news.
Nearly all TV stations, nearly all newspapers, nearly everything. So here is the reality. Here is again the thing that maybe
the fact that they're
from
countering,
Europe, it's hard to understand.
But the fact that they're countering what we're seeing on state television, the version of which is that the protesters started it all, these other television stations are in contradiction with the state television. Is that a sign that those oligarchs are maybe letting the journalists do their job, and that
well, of course, those oligarchs, they are not silly people. At least they know how to earn a lot of money, right? So it's already a sign. They are criminals, but they're not stupid. So of course, definitely they know that at some point they have to, because with an internet and everything, you can see a lot of people who are blogging and they cannot just show completely different information. But Russian journalists can. For example, in Russia, people are just like what Russian state media are showing is just something so far from the reality. Also here, talking about Russia, I want to go back to the question you asked, either or. The thing is that Putin, he wants only like that. He doesn't want all together. Because here is not a question, it's not a question, national question of Ukraine only. It's a question of relationship between Russia and Central Europe. And the issue is much bigger than just national Ukrainian question. So here is, let's not forget about big guy, Putin, not physically, but in power. So this guy he doesn't want all together. He doesn't want peace. He wants either or. So Yanukovych, as a puppet, as a small doll, he's lost. He doesn't know what to do.
Hang on a sec. You call him a small doll, but he was at odds with Putin You remember they were stopping the trucks going from Ukraine to Russia over the summer.
Yeah, because he's not just a puppet. At some point, he doesn't want to stay as a puppet. He wants to be Putin as well.
Or Lukashenko.
Or Lukashenko, sure. Yeah.
All right.
That is even worse.
I'm not sure that his supporters will agree with that. Russia's president, though, it is true, keeping a close watch on it all. Vladimir Putin, who has pulled no punches when it comes to the opposition in Ukraine.
We heard threats from our European partners in reference to Ukraine, right up to the possibility of helping organize mass demonstrations. This is pressure, this is blackmail, and whether Ukraine and the Ukrainian government will give in to this blackmail, or whether it will be able to withstand it and make a decision based upon the national interests of the country, we will find out in the next few days.
Victor Nadyin-Ravevsky, do you agree that there's been blackmail on the part of the EU to twist the arm of that opposition, to manipulate it?
Well, you see, it seems to me it's quite just a legend, nothing else. And when I'm hearing that Yanukovych is a Russian puppet, that's simply nonsense. It's simply funny to hear this. Well, he plays his own game. He has oligarchs who play with him. Some of them have a very good business with Europe and Russia. They have restructured it. And so they're backing now the idea of joining anyhow the European Union structures. But of course, they'll have no rights there. They will have nothing there. They'll have to cut their own industry and nothing else. And they'll have problems, and really serious problems. Well, but if they do want, let them have them. No problem. That is the idea, the main idea. And as for speaking as for Russians and the whole, I don't think that we have a majority that is backing the idea of feeding Ukraine. Well, there is no intention of this type at all. If they're playing their games, let them.
All right. So your feeling is that Russia doesn't need Ukraine as much as Ukraine needs Russia. Celestine Bowen, it is true.
Well, Ukraine needs Russia, and Russia needs Ukraine. Yeah, but you see, we can survive without Ukraine. As for Ukraine, well, only future will show.
Celestine Bowen?
I mean, I think it's... actually, I think for Russia, Ukraine is larger than just a market or, a country of 46 million people. It's a country with a long history, tied, huge emotional issues, I think, on both sides. And I don't, in Ukraine, they're pro and con Russia emotions. So, I mean, I think that's why the situation is so complicated.
By the way, events, I just want to interrupt you for 1 second here to tell you that events in Ukraine being closely watched elsewhere, an argument over the demonstrations in Kiev sparking a brawl inside of the Georgian parliament this Wednesday. You can see some of the images of it there. Wow. But this shows how, you were saying how there's much more at stake than just bilateral relations here.
I mean, I do think this whole crisis would be useful if it could get to the point where both sides stop calling each other, that the Russians say it's all Europe's fault and it's blackmail, or that the European Union doesn't sort of take into account. I think a major failing in their negotiations over this is to take into account the economic ties between Russia and Ukraine.
Is Catherine Ashton helping or hurting by being there?
I think it's good that Europe be there. I think it's important to keep it from becoming violent, and I think that is at this point still a very disquieting fear among people that this could really get out of control, and then people could get hurt, and that's a terrible thing in itself, but it would only spiral the political crisis into another realm.
All right, one viewer is saying to us, Ukraine should vote in a referendum to decide its fate. One final question just for you, Ina Shevchenko, very briefly. You're from a Russian-speaking area inside Ukraine.
Yes, but I do speak Ukrainian.
Oh, you do speak Ukrainian, but how would you say, again, how do you see Ukraine evolving? Is it going to be split forever, or do you see Ukraine more and more, the Ukrainian-speaking and the Russian-speaking side gelling?
I think this is the point of people at the square right now, that we don't want to be divided one more time. We don't want to be divided in pieces for one empire and another empire. We want to be an independent state. 22 years already of independence of Ukraine, we're keeping it, and we didn't reach, of course, definitely the level that people are dreaming about. But again, I call everyone to recognize that those dreamers that are right now at Maidan and at Independence Square, they are for independent, solid Ukraine, not divided into pieces and not again, hurting each other or fighting between each other. So right now, I think what is the most important thing is to recognize those people. We all recognize Yanukovych as a bastard. We all recognize Putin as a bastard. But so right now, we have to recognize those people as the heroes that are fighting for their country. That's
all right, Ina Shevchenko, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for your forward words. And I want to thank as well Victor Nadayin-Rayevsky for being with us from Moscow. Celestine Bone, thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.